The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand corridors of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III made his way to the breakfast room. His footsteps echoed against the marble floors, a sound that had become as familiar to the palace staff as the chiming of Big Ben. But today was different. Today, whispers followed in his wake, carrying rumors that would shake the very foundations of the royal household. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the palace's most senior lady-in-waiting, paused in her morning duties as she observed the king's unusually brisk pace. She had served the royal family for over 3 decades, witnessing countless moments of triumph and scandal, but something in the air felt unprecedented. The king's private secretary, James Whitmore, hurried past her with an expression that spoke of urgent matters demanding immediate attention. In the queen consort's private quarters, Camilla sat before her ornate vanity mirror, her reflection showing the subtle signs of concern that had begun to etch themselves across her features over the past several weeks. Her personal maid, Sarah, moved quietly around the room, arranging the day's schedule with practiced efficiency. Yet both women were acutely aware of the growing tension that seemed to permeate every corner of their once peaceful domain. The source of this upheaval had a name that was spoken in hushed tones throughout the palace: Catherine, Princess of Wales. Kate, as she was affectionately known to the public, had somehow managed to capture not just the hearts of the British people, but something far more significant: the undivided attention and apparent favor of her father-in-law, the king. Charles had always maintained cordial relationships with his children's spouses, but his bond with Kate had evolved into something that palace insiders found both remarkable and troubling. Where once he might have consulted Camilla on matters of state protocol or charitable endeavors, he now increasingly turned to his daughter-in-law for counsel and companionship. The transformation had been gradual at first, almost imperceptible to those not intimately familiar with the intricate dynamics of royal life. It began with small gestures, Charles personally ensuring that Kate received the finest accommodations during state visits, requesting her presence at private dinners that traditionally included only immediate family, and seeking her opinion on matters that had previously been the exclusive domain of his wife. Dr. Helena Morrison, a palace historian who had been documenting royal traditions for the past 15 years, noticed a shift during a garden party hosted for foreign dignitaries. She watched as Charles spent nearly an hour in animated conversation with Kate, their discussion ranging from environmental conservation to the future of the Commonwealth. Meanwhile, Camilla stood with a group of visiting wives, her smile polite but strained as she observed her husband's obvious enthusiasm for his daughter-in-law's company. The palace staff began to take notice when Charles started requesting Kate's input on decisions that would typically involve the queen consort. The weekly meetings that had once been sacred time for Charles and Camilla to discuss their shared responsibilities as the reigning couple were increasingly interrupted by summons for Kate to join them. Sometimes, these interruptions would result in Camilla being politely dismissed while Charles continued his discussions with Kate in private. Princess, and Charles's sister, was among the first senior royals to recognize the implications of this shifting dynamic. During a private family dinner at Windsor Castle, she observed her brother's behavior with the keen eye of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating royal politics. The way Charles's entire demeanor would brighten when Kate entered a room, how he would unconsciously lean forward when she spoke, and, most tellingly, how he would defer to her judgment on matters where he had previously been decisively independent. The breaking point came during preparations for the annual state opening of Parliament. Traditionally, the queen consort would work closely with the king to plan the ceremonial aspects of this important constitutional event. However, this year, Charles surprised everyone by requesting that Kate take the lead on coordinating with the various government officials and ceremonial experts involved in the planning process. Lord Hampton, the palace's chief of protocol, found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining to Camilla why her usual role had been reassigned. The conversation, which took place in the privacy of the queen consort's study, was marked by a level of tension that the seasoned diplomat had rarely encountered in his years of service. Camilla's response was measured but telling. Rather than expressing outright anger or confronting Charles directly, she began to implement subtle changes of her own. She started accepting more solo engagements, often scheduling them at times when she knew Charles would be meeting with Kate. Her public appearances took on a more independent tone, as if she were deliberately establishing her own sphere of influence separate from her husband's growing preoccupation with his daughter-in-law. The palace's senior staff found themselves caught in an increasingly delicate situation. Messages that would normally be relayed through established channels now had to be carefully considered based on the evolving preferences of the king. Information that Charles once shared freely with his wife was now often discussed first with Kate, leaving Camilla to learn about important decisions secondhand. Sir Geoffrey Pemberton, the private secretary who had served Charles for over a decade, began maintaining separate briefing documents, one for discussions with the king and Camilla together, and another for the private sessions that Charles increasingly preferred to hold with Kate. The duplication of effort was unprecedented in Sir Geoffrey's experience, but necessary to navigate the complex new reality of royal administration. Meanwhile, William found himself in the uncomfortable position of watching his wife become increasingly central to his father's world, while simultaneously observing his stepmother's gradual marginalization. The Prince of Wales had always maintained a respectful relationship with Camilla, understanding her importance to his father's happiness. But the current situation created tensions that threatened to complicate family gatherings and official functions. Kate, for her part, seemed genuinely unaware of the controversy her elevated status was creating. Her natural warmth and intelligence had always made her a valuable member of the royal family, but she appeared to view her increased responsibilities as a natural evolution of her role, rather than something that might be causing distress to others. Her focus remained on fulfilling her duties with a grace and dedication that had earned her widespread public admiration. The public, largely unaware of these internal dynamics, continued to shower Kate with affection and praise. Her approval ratings consistently outpaced those of other senior royals, including Camilla, which only served to reinforce Charles's apparent belief that his daughter-in-law was the royal family's greatest asset in maintaining public support and relevance in modern Britain. As autumn arrived at the palace, the situation had reached a point where even the most diplomatic staff members could no longer pretend that everything was proceeding normally. The king's preferences had become so pronounced that they were affecting the basic functioning of the royal household. Invitations to state dinners were being revised to ensure Kate's prominent placement, while Camilla found her traditional roles being quietly redistributed to others. The queen consort's closest advisors began suggesting that she might need to address the situation directly with Charles, but Camilla remained hesitant to create a confrontation that could have unpredictable consequences for the monarchy's stability. Her years of experience with royal protocol had taught her that patience and careful maneuvering were often more effective than direct challenges to established authority. However, patience was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the palace's normal rhythms continued to be disrupted by Charles's obvious favoritism. The king seemed oblivious to the discomfort his behavior was causing, perhaps believing that his actions were simply reflecting the natural appeal and capabilities of his daughter-in-law, rather than creating an unprecedented situation that threatened to undermine his wife's position and authority. As the season progressed, it became clear that this was not a temporary fascination that would fade with time, but rather a fundamental shift in how Charles viewed the royal family's hierarchy and his own relationships within it. The palace watched in growing astonishment as their sovereign continued to elevate Kate's role while seemingly diminishing that of his own wife, creating a situation that defied both precedent and expectation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only the personal relationships within the royal family, but also the very foundations upon which the modern monarchy had been built. The ancient walls of the palace had witnessed many dramatic moments throughout British history, but few as potentially destabilizing as the quiet revolution taking place in the private chambers and meeting rooms where the future of the crown was being determined by the complex interplay of personal preferences and constitutional duty. The first signs of open rebellion came from an unexpected source. Lady Elizabeth Fairfax, Camilla's closest friend and confidant for over 20 years, made a decision that would send shockwaves through the royal establishment. During a private tea service in the Queen Consort's personal drawing room, she spoke words that had been building in her heart for months. Lady Fairfax had watched her dear friend endure the gradual erosion of her position with the stoic grace that had characterized Camilla's entire journey from controversial figure to respected Queen Consort. But the latest incident, Charles publicly praising Kate's handling of a diplomatic reception while barely acknowledging Camilla's presence at the same event, had pushed Lady Fairfax beyond her limit of diplomatic silence. The conversation between the two women lasted well into the evening, with Lady Fairfax encouraging Camilla to assert herself more forcefully. She reminded the Queen Consort of her years of dedicated service, her growth into the role that had once seemed impossible, and her right to expect her husband's respect and support. The discussion marked a turning point, not just for Camilla personally, but for how the situation would unfold in the weeks to come. Meanwhile, Charles remained seemingly oblivious to the growing undercurrent of tension his behavior had created. His days had taken on a new pattern that centered increasingly around meetings and activities that included Kate. The king's personal calendar, once carefully balanced between constitutional duties, personal time with Camilla, and family obligations, had become heavily weighted toward engagements that provided opportunities for collaboration with his daughter-in-law. The palace's chief housekeeper, Mrs. Dorothy Ashworth, who had managed the domestic staff for nearly 2 decades, began noticing changes in the way the royal apartments were being used. Charles's private study, once a sanctuary where he met exclusively with senior advisors and occasionally his wife, was now frequently occupied by planning sessions that included Kate. The informal afternoon teas that had been a beloved tradition for Charles and Camilla were becoming increasingly rare, replaced by working sessions that focused on projects and initiatives that captured the king's imagination. Kate's own schedule reflected her new reality, though she approached each additional responsibility with the dedication and professionalism that had always characterized her approach to royal duties. Her staff noticed that she was spending more time in preparation for meetings with the king, researching topics that range from environmental policy to constitutional law. What had once been occasional consultations had evolved into regular strategy sessions that resembled those typically held between a monarch and his or her closest advisors. The international diplomatic community began to take notice of these shifting dynamics during a state visit from the Canadian Prime Minister. Protocol dictated that such visits would involve carefully orchestrated interactions between the visiting dignitaries and senior members of the royal family, with specific roles assigned based on constitutional hierarchy and established precedent. However, observers were surprised to see Kate playing a more prominent role in the discussions than Camilla, despite the Queen Consort's higher constitutional position. Ambassador Patricia Henley, Canada's representative to the Court of St. James, later noted in her confidential report to Ottawa that the traditional balance of royal participation seemed to be undergoing significant modification. Her observations, which would eventually make their way into diplomatic cables that circulated among Commonwealth nations, suggested that the British royal family was experiencing an internal realignment that could have implications for future state relationships. The situation became even more complex when Charles began including Kate in meetings with government ministers that traditionally involved only the monarch and the Queen Consort. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak found himself navigating conversations where Kate's input was not only welcomed, but actively solicited by the king, creating unprecedented protocol challenges for both Downing Street and the palace. Sir Malcolm Thornley, the cabinet secretary who served as the senior civil servant liaison between the government and the royal household, found himself in the delicate position of briefing ministerial staff on how to handle these evolving dynamics. His guidance emphasized the need to respect both constitutional precedent and the king's clearly expressed preferences, though privately he worried about the long-term implications for the monarchy's institutional stability. The royal protection officers, whose responsibility extended beyond physical security to include managing access and maintaining the confidentiality of royal activities, began noticing patterns that reflected the changing power dynamics within the palace. Requests for Kate's security detail to accompany her to meetings that were not originally on her public schedule became more frequent, while Camilla's security needs seemed to be decreasing as her direct involvement in certain royal functions diminished. Commander Sarah Phillips, the senior protection officer responsible for coordinating royal family security, implemented new protocols to ensure that adequate protection was provided for all members regardless of the shifting patterns of their activities. Her team's reports, which were shared with the Metropolitan Police's Royal Protection Unit, reflected the operational challenges created by the evolving situation without explicitly commenting on the political implications. The Palace Press Office faced its own challenges as royal correspondents began asking increasingly pointed questions about the apparent changes in royal family dynamics. Melissa Crawford, the deputy press secretary who handled day-to-day media inquiries, found herself crafting responses that acknowledged Kate's expanded role while avoiding any suggestion that Camilla's position was being diminished. The careful language required for these communications reflected the delicate balance between maintaining institutional dignity and addressing legitimate journalistic interest. The situation reached a new level of complexity when foreign journalists began writing analytical pieces about the British royal family's internal dynamics. Publications in France, Germany, and Australia ran articles speculating about the relationship between Charles and his daughter-in-law, often framing their analysis in terms that suggested a fundamental shift in how the British monarchy was operating. These international perspectives, while not always accurate in their details, captured the essential truth that something unprecedented was happening within the royal household. Queen Camilla's response to these mounting pressures demonstrated the diplomatic skills she had developed over her years in royal service. Rather than engaging in direct confrontation or public statements that might damage the monarchy's reputation, she began implementing a strategy of quiet independence that asserted her own authority while avoiding open conflict with her husband's preferences. She accepted an invitation to serve as patron of several new charitable organizations, roles that would require extensive travel and public appearances independent of the king's schedule. Her private secretary, Jonathan Mills, coordinated these new commitments to ensure that Camilla would have a robust and visible public profile that demonstrated her continued relevance and authority as queen consort. The strategy proved effective in maintaining public awareness of Camilla's contributions while providing her with opportunities to demonstrate her capabilities without being overshadowed by Charles's obvious preference for Kate's company. Her appearances at hospital openings, university ceremonies, and cultural events showcased the experience and gravitas she had developed over years of royal service. However, the private cost of this strategic independence was considerable. Friends noticed that Camilla had become more guarded in her conversations, less willing to share the kind of personal reflections that had once characterized her relationships with those closest to her. The emotional toll of managing a situation that challenged both her personal happiness and her constitutional role was evident to those who knew her well, even as she maintained perfect public composure. The palace staff found themselves adapting to a new reality where traditional lines of authority had become blurred. Senior servants who had once looked exclusively to the queen consort for guidance on matters of household management now found themselves consulting with Kate's office on decisions that affected her increasing presence in royal activities. The practical implications of this shift extended to everything from catering arrangements to security protocols. Mrs. Ashworth, the chief housekeeper, developed new systems for managing the complex scheduling requirements created by the evolving situation. Her staff needed to prepare different royal apartments for meetings that might involve various combinations of family members, often with little advance notice, as the king's preferences for including Kate in discussions became more spontaneous and frequent. The financial implications of these changes were managed by Sir David Richardson, the keeper of the privy purse, who oversaw the royal household's budget and expenditures. He noted increasing costs associated with Kate's expanded security requirements and travel arrangements, expenses that reflected her new role's practical demands, while raising questions about the long-term financial sustainability of the current arrangements. As winter approached, the situation had evolved from a series of individual incidents into a systematic reorganization of royal family hierarchy that defied both precedent and expectation. The king's favoritism toward Kate had become so pronounced that it was affecting fundamental aspects of how the monarchy functioned, from constitutional consultations to social engagements. The most telling sign of how far the situation had progressed came during planning for the annual Christmas celebrations at Sandringham. Traditionally, these arrangements were coordinated jointly by the king and queen consort, reflecting both their personal relationship and their shared role as hosts for the extended royal family. This year, however, Charles delegated primary responsibility for the Christmas planning to Kate, effectively sidelining Camilla from organizing one of the most important family gatherings of the year. The decision sent clear signals throughout the royal establishment about the new hierarchy that was taking shape. Staff members who had served the family for decades found themselves adjusting to a reality where Kate's preferences carried more weight than established traditions, while Camilla's role continued to be redefined in ways that seemed to diminish her authority and influence. The palace corridors buzzed with conversations about how long this situation could continue without reaching some kind of resolution. The institutional memory of the royal household included many examples of family tensions and personal conflicts, but few precedents for a situation where a reigning monarch's relationship with his daughter-in-law appeared to be superseding his bond with his own wife in matters both personal and constitutional. The confrontation that the palace had been dreading finally materialized on a cold February morning during what should have been a routine meeting about the upcoming Commonwealth Day celebrations. The timing was particularly significant, as Commonwealth Day represented one of the monarchy's most important annual events, requiring careful coordination between all senior royals to ensure its success and symbolic impact. Charles had called the meeting to discuss the ceremonial arrangements, and, as had become his custom, he included Kate in the planning session alongside Camilla and other senior staff members. The agenda covered traditional elements such as the service at Westminster Abbey, the reception for Commonwealth High Commissioners, and the various media opportunities that would showcase the royal family's commitment to the Commonwealth nations. However, what should have been a straightforward planning session became the flashpoint for months of accumulated tension when Charles announced his intention to have Kate deliver the keynote address at the Commonwealth Youth Forum, a role that had been promised to Camilla 3 months earlier. The Queen Consort had been preparing extensively for this speaking engagement, working with speechwriters and policy experts to craft a presentation that would highlight her own charitable work with young people across the Commonwealth. The silence that followed Charles's announcement was deafening. Sir Geoffrey Pemberton, the private secretary, found himself in the unprecedented position of witnessing a direct challenge to royal protocol unfold before his eyes. Lady Margaret Thornfield, who had been quietly documenting the meeting's agenda, stopped writing entirely as she absorbed the implications of what she had just heard. Camilla's response was measured but unmistakably firm. She reminded Charles of their previous agreement regarding her Commonwealth Day responsibilities and questioned the wisdom of making such significant changes so close to the event. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years learning to navigate royal protocols and who understood the importance of maintaining consistency in public commitments. For the first time in months, Charles appeared genuinely surprised by resistance to his preferences. He had become so accustomed to having his decisions regarding Kate's involvement accepted without question that he seemed genuinely unprepared for Camilla's direct challenge. The king's discomfort was evident as he struggled to provide a rationale for his decision that went beyond his obvious preference for Kate's participation. Kate herself appeared deeply uncomfortable with the situation, suggesting that perhaps the original arrangements should be maintained. Her attempt to defuse the tension demonstrated the grace that had endeared her to the public, but it also highlighted her awareness that she had become an unwitting catalyst for a conflict that threatened the family's stability. The meeting concluded without resolution, leaving staff members with the impossible task of proceeding with Commonwealth Day preparations while fundamental questions about roles and responsibilities remained unanswered. The unprecedented nature of the standoff meant that there were no established protocols for resolving such a direct disagreement between the king and queen consort. In the days that followed, the palace became divided into unofficial camps as staff members found themselves navigating loyalties and professional obligations that had suddenly become complicated. Sir Geoffrey worked frantically behind the scenes to find a compromise solution that would preserve both constitutional propriety and family harmony, while avoiding any public indication of the internal discord. The Queen Consort's decision to maintain her position on the Commonwealth Day arrangements marked a significant shift in her approach to the ongoing situation. Rather than continuing her strategy of quiet adaptation, she had chosen to assert her constitutional prerogatives directly, signaling that there were limits to how far she would allow her role to be diminished. Lady Fairfax rallied other members of Camilla's inner circle to provide support during this challenging period. The network of friends and advisors who had helped the Queen Consort navigate previous difficulties in her royal journey now mobilized to offer both emotional support and strategic counsel. Their collective experience included managing media scrutiny, family tensions, and constitutional complexities, making them valuable allies in the current crisis. Princess Anne's intervention came as a surprise to many observers, as Charles's sister had generally maintained a policy of non-interference in family disputes. However, the Princess Royal's deep understanding of royal duty and constitutional propriety led her to arrange a private conversation with her brother about the implications of his recent decisions. Their discussion, which took place during a private dinner at Gackham Park, focused on the long-term consequences of allowing personal preferences to override established protocol. Princess Anne's perspective carried particular weight because of her reputation for uncompromising dedication to royal duty and her frank communication style. She reminded Charles that the monarchy's strength had always depended on maintaining clear hierarchies and respecting constitutional roles, regardless of personal feelings or preferences. Her intervention represented the voice of royal tradition, speaking to a sovereign who seemed to have lost sight of fundamental institutional principles. The impact of Princess Anne's conversation with Charles became evident within days, as the king's behavior began to show subtle signs of modification. While his obvious affection for Kate remained unchanged, his public demonstrations of preference became less pronounced, and he began making visible efforts to include Camilla more prominently in royal activities. The resolution of the Commonwealth Day dispute came through a compromise that demonstrated diplomatic creativity while preserving the dignity of all parties involved. Kate agreed to participate in the Youth Forum as a panel discussant rather than as the keynote speaker, while Camilla maintained her original role as the primary presenter. The arrangement allowed Charles to showcase Kate's involvement while respecting Camilla's constitutional position and prior commitments. However, the temporary resolution of this specific conflict did not address the underlying tensions that had created the crisis. Palace staff remained acutely aware that the fundamental dynamics responsible for the situation had not changed significantly, leaving open the possibility of future confrontations if the king's preferences again conflicted with established protocols. The Commonwealth Day events themselves proceeded with the polished execution that characterized major royal occasions, but those closely involved could detect subtle signs of the recent tensions. The carefully choreographed interactions between Charles, Camilla, and Kate reflected the compromise arrangements, while body language experts and royal watchers noted nuances in their public interactions that suggested ongoing complexities beneath the surface harmony. Media coverage of Commonwealth Day focused primarily on the success of the events and the positive reception of the royal family's presentations. However, a few perceptive royal correspondents noted changes in the traditional patterns of royal participation that hinted at internal adjustments without explicitly speculating about their causes. The international diplomatic community, particularly representatives from Commonwealth nations, observed the proceedings with the trained eye of professionals accustomed to reading subtle signals in high-level interactions. Their reports back to their respective governments included observations about apparent modifications in royal protocol that could have implications for future diplomatic engagements. Sir Malcolm Thornley, in his capacity as cabinet secretary, briefed the Prime Minister on the successful resolution of what he diplomatically described as scheduling complexities related to royal family engagements. His report emphasized the professionalism with which all parties had handled the situation while noting the importance of maintaining clear communication channels between Downing Street and the palace to prevent similar issues in the future. The aftermath of the Commonwealth Day events provided an opportunity for reflection and adjustment within the royal household. Charles, influenced by his sister's counsel and the visible stress that the recent conflict had placed on his family, began to demonstrate more conscious attention to the balance of his relationships and responsibilities. Kate's response to the situation revealed both her emotional intelligence and her commitment to the long-term health of the royal family. She initiated private conversations with Camilla aimed at clarifying her role and ensuring that her increased responsibilities did not inadvertently undermine the Queen Consort's authority. These discussions marked the beginning of a more collaborative approach that acknowledged the complexity of their respective positions. The Queen Consort's handling of the crisis had demonstrated her growth into her constitutional role while maintaining the personal dignity that had characterized her journey from controversial figure to respected family member. Her willingness to assert her prerogatives when necessary, combined with her gracious acceptance of the compromise solution, showcased the political skills she had developed over years of navigating royal protocols. Palace staff began implementing new procedures designed to prevent similar conflicts in the future. Sir Geoffrey established more formal consultation processes for major decisions involving multiple family members, while the press office developed guidelines for managing public announcements about royal responsibilities to ensure consistency with constitutional hierarchies. The lessons learned for the Commonwealth Day crisis extended beyond immediate protocol adjustments to fundamental questions about how the monarchy would adapt to changing personalities and relationships while maintaining institutional stability. The palace had successfully navigated a significant challenge, but the underlying dynamics that had created the situation remained a subject of ongoing attention and careful management. As spring arrived at Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere reflected both relief at having resolved the immediate crisis and awareness that the relationships within the royal family had been permanently altered by the events of recent months. The king's favoritism toward Kate had not disappeared, but it had been channeled into forms that were more compatible with constitutional propriety and family harmony. The palace staff, who had witnessed the entire evolution of this unprecedented situation, carried forward the knowledge that royal family dynamics were more fragile and complex than many had previously understood. Their experience managing the crisis had provided valuable lessons about the intersection of personal relationships and constitutional duty that would inform their approach to future challenges. The resolution of the Commonwealth Day crisis marked a turning point, but it was clear to all involved that the royal family was still adapting to new realities that had been created by the king's obvious preference for his daughter-in-law's company and counsel. The immediate threat to institutional stability had been addressed, but the ongoing process of finding sustainable balance remained a work in progress. The summer months brought an unexpected development that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the royal family's internal dynamics. Queen Camilla announced her intention to undertake an extensive solo tour of the Pacific Commonwealth nations, a journey that would establish her as an independent diplomatic force while providing necessary space for the family relationships to stabilize. The tour, which would span 6 weeks and include visits to Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, and several Pacific Island nations, represented the most ambitious independent initiative of Camilla's reign as Queen Consort. Her decision to propose such an extensive solo engagement demonstrated both her confidence in her own abilities and her strategic understanding of how to maintain her relevance while allowing the situation at home to evolve naturally. Charles's response to Camilla's announcement revealed the complexity of his own feelings about the recent tensions. While he expressed public support for the Queen Consort's initiative, palace insiders noted his obvious discomfort with the idea of extended separation. The king had become so accustomed to having either Camilla or Kate available for consultation and companionship that the prospect of Camilla's extended absence created anxiety about how he would manage his various responsibilities and personal needs. The planning for Camilla's Pacific tour provided an opportunity for her to demonstrate the full extent of her diplomatic capabilities. Working with the Foreign Office and Commonwealth Secretariat, she developed an itinerary that would address important issues ranging from climate change adaptation to cultural preservation, while showcasing her own areas of expertise and personal interests. Sir David Henley, the Foreign Secretary, praised Camilla's proposed tour as an excellent opportunity to strengthen Commonwealth relationships while highlighting Britain's continued commitment to the Pacific region. His public statements reflected genuine enthusiasm for the Queen Consort's initiative, but privately, Foreign Office officials noted the unusual nature of such an extensive solo tour by a Queen Consort. Meanwhile, Kate found herself in the position of needing to carefully navigate her relationship with Charles during Camilla's absence. The Princess of Wales had grown increasingly aware of the complications created by her elevated status in the king's affections, and she approached the summer period with determination to support both her father-in-law and stepmother-in-law in ways that would strengthen rather than strain family relationships. The departure of Queen Camilla for her Pacific tour was marked by an elaborate ceremony at RAF Northolt that demonstrated the full honors accorded to a senior royal on an official overseas mission. Charles's farewell to his wife was publicly affectionate but privately emotional, reflecting his recognition that their relationship was entering a new phase that would require adjustments on both sides. During Camilla's absence, the palace developed new routines that distributed her usual responsibilities among other family members and staff. Kate assumed some ceremonial duties that had typically been handled by the Queen Consort, but these were balanced with increased roles for Princess and other senior royals to avoid any appearance that Kate was simply stepping into Camilla's position. The king's behavior during this period provided valuable insights into his true feelings about the situation that had developed over the previous year. Without the constant presence of either his wife or daughter-in-law to focus his attention, Charles began to demonstrate a more balanced approach to his various relationships and responsibilities. Weekly video calls between Charles and Camilla during her tour became a cornerstone of maintaining their connection despite the physical distance. These conversations, which typically lasted an hour or more, allowed them to share experiences and maintain their partnership in ways that had been complicated by the presence of Kate and the tensions that her elevated status had created. Camilla's tour proved to be a remarkable success, generating positive media coverage throughout the Commonwealth and establishing her as a respected diplomatic figure in her own right. Her speeches on environmental conservation and women's rights were particularly well received, demonstrating expertise and passion that had been somewhat overshadowed by the recent palace dynamics. The Queen Consort's meetings with Pacific Island leaders addressed critical issues, such as rising sea levels and economic development, topics that allowed her to showcase both her understanding of complex policy matters and genuine concern for Commonwealth communities facing significant challenges. Her approach combined royal dignity with accessible warmth, creating connections that would benefit British diplomatic relationships for years to come. Back in London, Kate's handling of her increased responsibilities during Camilla's absence demonstrated the maturity and diplomatic skill that had originally attracted Charles's attention. However, she was careful to frame her temporary elevation as service to the crown rather than personal advancement, making frequent public references to the Queen Consort's important work abroad and expressing anticipation for her return. The palace staff noticed significant changes in the king's demeanor as Camilla's tour progressed. His initial anxiety about managing without her presence gradually gave way to pride in her achievements and recognition of her unique value to the monarchy. The distance seemed to provide perspective that had been missing during the intensity of the previous months. Princess Anne's continued involvement in family affairs provided stability during this transitional period. Her practical approach to royal duties and her frank communication style helped maintain institutional continuity while allowing other family members to adjust to their evolving roles without creating additional stress or uncertainty. The international media coverage of Camilla's tour contributed to a broader reassessment of her contributions to the monarchy. Publications that had previously focused primarily on the tensions surrounding Kate's elevated status began to provide more balanced coverage that recognized both women's distinct strengths and contributions to royal family effectiveness. Parliamentary observers noted the positive diplomatic outcomes of Camilla's tour, with several MPs commenting on the value of having senior royals who could represent British interests independently while maintaining the dignity and effectiveness that characterized the best royal diplomatic efforts. These observations filtered back to the palace as evidence of Camilla's growing stature as a constitutional figure. The Queen Consort's return from her Pacific tour was marked by genuine celebration at the palace, with staff and family members alike recognizing that her journey had been transformative both personally and institutionally. Charles's welcome home for his wife reflected a renewed appreciation for her capabilities and a recognition of how much he had missed her partnership. The period following Camilla's return saw the implementation of new arrangements that built upon the lessons learned during her absence. Charles began to demonstrate more conscious attention to balance in his relationships with both his wife and daughter-in-law, while Kate and Camilla established their own direct communication channels that allowed them to coordinate their activities more effectively. The establishment of what palace insiders came to call the new equilibrium reflected a sophisticated understanding of how personal relationships and constitutional duties could be balanced to serve both individual happiness and institutional effectiveness. Charles maintained his obvious affection for Kate while recommitting to his partnership with Camilla in ways that honored both relationships appropriately. Kate's role evolved into something more clearly defined and sustainable, with increased responsibilities that reflected her capabilities while respecting the constitutional hierarchy that placed Camilla in the senior position. This arrangement satisfied Charles's desire for Kate's involvement while addressing the concerns that had created tension throughout the previous year. The Queen Consort's experience during her Pacific tour had provided her with confidence and perspective that transformed her approach to her royal role. She returned with enhanced credibility as an independent diplomatic figure and a clearer understanding of her own value to the monarchy, reducing her sensitivity to Charles's favoritism toward Kate. The palace staff implemented new protocols that institutionalized the lessons learned from the challenging period. These included regular coordination meetings between the offices of senior royals, more formal consultation processes for major decisions, and clearer guidelines for managing family dynamics while maintaining constitutional propriety. The resolution of what had become known within palace circles as the favoritism crisis demonstrated the monarchy's capacity for adaptation and growth. The institution had successfully navigated a situation that had no clear precedents while maintaining public dignity and constitutional effectiveness. As autumn returned to the palace, the atmosphere reflected a new maturity in royal family relationships that had been forged through the challenges of the previous year. The king's relationship with Kate remained warm and collaborative, but it was now balanced by his renewed appreciation for Camilla's unique contributions and his recognition of the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries. The public remained largely unaware of the internal struggles that had shaped these developments, seeing only the polished results of careful diplomacy and institutional adaptation. The royal family's ability to resolve their differences privately while maintaining public effectiveness had protected the monarchy's reputation while allowing personal relationships to evolve naturally. The final chapter of this unprecedented period in royal history was written during the Christmas celebrations at Sandringham, where the family gathering reflected the new equilibrium that had been achieved. Charles, Camilla, and Kate each occupied clearly defined roles that honored their relationships while respecting constitutional hierarchy and family harmony. The palace staff, who had navigated the complexities of this situation with remarkable skill and discretion, looked back on the period as a testament to the monarchy's resilience and adaptability. They had learned valuable lessons about managing personal dynamics within constitutional constraints that would serve them well in future challenges. The transformation that had occurred within the royal family demonstrated that even the most traditional institutions could adapt and grow while maintaining their essential character. The king's favoritism toward Kate had been channeled into constructive collaboration. Camilla had emerged as a more independent and confident queen consort, and the monarchy had proven its capacity for managing complex personal relationships without sacrificing institutional effectiveness. The final assessment of this period would ultimately be written by history, but the immediate outcome suggested that the royal family had successfully navigated a significant challenge while strengthening rather than weakening their institutional foundations. The palace watched with satisfaction as the new arrangements settled into routine, providing stability and predictability while preserving the relationships that had created both the crisis and its ultimate resolution.